let's notice several other texts from the Bible that use this expression flesh or flesh and blood. Notice 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 50. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 50. It says there, "Now this I say, brethren, that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God." Let me ask you, does that mean that in the kingdom of God we're not going to have flesh and blood? Does that mean that we're going to have some ghostly existence with no flesh and blood at all? Of course not. When it says flesh and blood shall not inherit the kingdom of God, that phrase is explained in the next phrase. It says, "Nor does corruption inherit incorruption." So what does flesh and blood mean? It means our body in its present state of what? Of corruption. It's not talking about living in a spirit existence outside the body. When the Apostle Paul says to live in the flesh with flesh and blood, he's saying to stay in this body which is mortal and corruptible is better right now because it will bear fruit. We'll talk about the fruit in a few moments. By the way, when God's people resurrect, are they going to have a body? A real body? Yes. What kind of body? Well, go with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and let's start at verse 51. We're already there. "Behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed. In a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised." How? "Incorruptible, and we shall be changed." Now notice this. "For this corruptible," that is this flesh that we have now, "this corruptible must put on" what? "Incorruption, and this mortal must put on immortality. So, when this corruptible has put on incorruption, and this mortal has put on immortality, then shall be brought to pass the saying that is written, Death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your sting? O Hades, where is your victory?" So let me ask you, are we going to have a body in the kingdom come? Yes, we are. What kind of body? Immortal and incorruptible. But now we are in the flesh. We have flesh and blood, which means our present existence, our corruptible, mortal body. It's not that we now have a body and then we're not going to have a body. It means that now our body is corruptible and mortal, then our body will be immortal and incorruptible. Are you understanding what I'm saying? Now, let's look at another text that speaks about being in the flesh. Notice Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 7. By the way, while you're looking for Hebrews 5 verse 7, let me ask you this question. Do you believe that Jesus today has a body? Do you all believe he has a body? Does that body have bones and blood? Yes? Absolutely. We're going to notice it in a minute. But now notice the expression that is used about Jesus while he lived in this earth in a body that was subject to death and subject to weakness and subject to suffering. Notice Hebrews 5 verse 7. "Who in the days of his flesh," so now he doesn't have flesh, right? Of course he does. Is it a different kind of flesh? Yes, because his flesh now is what? Incorruptible and immortal. "Who in the days of his flesh, when he had offered up prayers and supplications with vehement cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and was heard because of his godly fear." Notice also Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 14. Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 14. It says there, "Inasmuch then as the children," that's us, "have partaken of flesh and blood, he himself likewise shared in the same." So did Jesus have flesh and blood like we have flesh and blood? Yes. Was he subject to death at that point? Of course, because he did die. And so it says, "that through death he might destroy him who had the power of death, that is the devil." So Jesus had flesh and blood. Question, did Jesus still have flesh and blood and bones after his resurrection? Of course he did. So when Jesus came forth from the grave, was he some kind of ghost or some kind of soul or spirit entity? Of course not. Notice what we find in Luke 24 and verse 39. Luke 24, 39. This is after the resurrection. Jesus says to his disciples, "Behold my hands and my feet." Did Jesus have hands and feet? So did he have a body? Of course he did. "Behold my hands and my feet, that it is I myself. Handle me and see. For a spirit does not have" what? "Flesh and bones, as you see that I have." So does Jesus have flesh and bones today? Of course he does. What is the distinction then? The distinction is, in the days of the flesh simply does not mean contrasting the flesh with the spirit or the soul. It's contrasting our present existence of corruptibility and mortality with our future existence of immortality and incorruptibility. Now, notice 1 Corinthians 15, 42 to 44, that puts it all together. 1 Corinthians 15, verses 42 to 44. "So also is the resurrection of the dead. The body is sown in corruption. It is raised in incorruption. It is sown in dishonor. It is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness. It is raised in power. It is sown a natural body. It is raised a spiritual body." There is a natural body and there is a spiritual body. I'd like to read a very interesting statement from Ellen White, the book Maranatha, which is a devotional book, page 301, where she speaks about the spiritual body and its relationship to the physical body. She says, Paul illustrates this subject, the subject of the verses that we just read. Paul illustrates this subject by the kernel of grain sown in the field. The planted kernel decays, but there comes forth a new kernel. Is this true, those of you who are into agriculture? Sure. The natural substance of the grain that decays is never raised as before, but God giveth it a body as it hath pleased him. A much finer material will compose the human body, for it is a new creation, a new birth. It is sown a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body. Now, why does the Apostle Paul say, but if I live in the flesh, this will mean fruit from my labor? In other words, if I live in this present existence, this will produce fruit. What did he mean by fruit? Well, let's go to Colossians chapter 1 and verses 5 and 6. Let's allow Paul to interpret Paul. Colossians 1, verses 5 and 6. Here the Apostle Paul says, because of the hope which is laid up for you in heaven, of which you heard before in the word of truth of the gospel. So he's talking about the preaching of the gospel, which has come to you, as it has also into all the world, and is bringing forth what? Fruit, as it is also among you since the day you heard and knew the grace of God in truth. So how was the preaching of the gospel bearing fruit? It was bearing fruit because souls were being won to the kingdom of Jesus Christ. Notice also John 12 and verse 24 on what the Apostle Paul means that if I live in the flesh, in other words, if I live in my present existence, in my corruptible mortal body, I'll be able to preach the gospel and people will come to the feet of Jesus and be saved. John chapter 12 verse 24 speaks about some Greeks that come to Jesus and they want Jesus to come and preach over in Greece. And Jesus says something